Carol and I were in New Zealand in 1977 when McDonald's arrived. For the first time, the Golden Arches appeared on Queen Street in downtown Auckland, and the Kiwis of New Zealand were so excited because they'd heard about McDonald's and for so long, and they were so excited. They flocked to this first one that was ever opened in New Zealand. And I felt like I should almost kind of give little warnings to say, it'll kill you, don't eat it. But I didn't. I joined, got in line with everybody else, and had the first Big Mac I'd had in a year or so, and I must admit it tasted really good at the time. Now, when McDonald's entered Italy, probably about that same time, it wasn't received with open arms like it was in New Zealand. The Italians, they love to eat. They savor their meals. And they started, in opposition to this fast food movement, they started a slow food movement. They really did. And they believe in that a meal should last for hours. It might be 5 or 6 courses, and it's a time not to rush this, but to take your time and to savor all of this. And the slow food movement was so successful that it was followed by what's called the slow city movement. Several cities decided that they wanted to preserve their heritage. They wanted to preserve their customs, and they didn't want to get caught up in the rush of the rest of the world where everything has got to be faster and immediate and instant. So the slow food movement was followed by the slow city movement, and cities like Creve, this little kind of bucolic, beautiful little city that was off to the side, they embraced this idea of the slow city more than perhaps any other place. And they became famous for this, that the lifestyle was just so ideal in this little city of Creve, Italy. It became so famous that the tourists began to flock to this city. And pretty soon the cafes were overflowing with people, and the little hotels were packed, and the stores were full, and the people could hardly keep up with the rush. They were rushing around trying to serve all of these people. And the New York Times went over to write an article about this, and they concluded that sometimes slowing down can really get hectic. We have found the same things, I think, in our life around here. We know that the pace of life continually gets faster and faster. We have to have everything instant. The internet has to be at super warp speeds because we can't wait for a second to get to the websites. And everything has got to be faster and faster, and it's so easy to get caught up in that even if you tell yourself to slow down, it can be very difficult to slow down when the whole world is moving at warp speed around you. In light of that, I wanted to bring you to one of my favorite psalms. It's an unusual psalm, and yet I think it speaks to this problem of our rushed society. And it's Psalm 131. This is a song of David, and I'll just want to read it to you first, and we'll go back over and take a look at it. My heart is not proud, Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me, but I have calmed and quieted myself. I am like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child, I am content. Israel, put your hope in the Lord, both now and forevermore. He starts this psalm by saying that his heart's not proud, his eyes are not haughty or proud, he's not concerning himself with great matters. David is saying, I'm not trying to learn the secrets of the universe or things that are above me. I want to concern myself with just the most important thing. And he compares himself to what he calls a weaned child. Now, David has noticed the difference between a child who is breastfeeding and a child who has been weaned and is no longer breastfeeding. And he's saying that the unweaned child, the one who is still breastfeeding, when the mother holds that child wants to eat. Those babies do basically two things. They sleep and they eat. And when they're awake, They are noisy children because they want to have their appetites met immediately. But once that child is weaned and is no longer breastfeeding, the mother can hold the child on their lap, and the child can be content and can rest and not be anxious to have their hunger met. So he says he's like the weaned child who is capable of stillness, who enters into a whole new relationship with his mother because he can appreciate her now as a person, not just some object that fills his belly. Now he can appreciate and have a relationship with his mother. He says, I want to be like a weaned child with its mother, and I am content. He desires contentment. He says, I have calmed and quieted myself. I want you to think about this and use this as a way of examining yourself. Just think back this past week and ask yourself, was there ever a few moments this past week where you calmed and quieted yourself in the presence of God? I'll be real honest with you. I go through a lot of weeks just kind of rushing from one thing to the next, trying to get things done. And a lot of times it's not because I have to be, but it's just kind of a habit that I've developed. I find myself speeding all the time, even when there's no deadline for me to get to where I'm going. I just have this feeling of being rushed. So I can look back at many days and say, no, there was never a time where I quieted myself in the presence of God because I was rushing too much. And David says, I have calmed and quieted myself. The little baby doesn't understand that. You know, the little baby just has to have the appetites met. And that's like a new Christian. When you're a baby Christian, you have to be fed the milk of the Word. And there might be a kind of an urgency in there to be fed and all these things. But as you grow and mature in Christ, you're no longer a slave to your appetites. And now you can begin to quiet yourself in the presence of God and really develop the relationship with your Father God. To learn to be quiet and to learn to be held, to allow God to hold you where you just relax in His presence and feel content. There's a man who is forever known as Bill W., who was an alcoholic. He saw that his alcoholism had taken everything from him, his job and his kids, his wife, and eventually his freedom, because he was thrown into prison and into jail at one point, and he hit rock bottom. And because of that, he developed what is now known as Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, and the very famous 12-step program that's used in many recovery programs today. He started this way. For Bill W. personally, he admitted that he was utterly powerless to manage his life. And that became step number one in the 12-step programs. He had tried many times to stop drinking and many times to control his life, and he realized he couldn't do it. He was utterly powerless. And that has become step one for many people who have been a slave to alcohol or drugs, realizing that they cannot change. So step one for him was to admit that he was powerless to manage his life. And then he realized that only a power greater than himself could restore his sanity. And that became step two in his progress. He knew that he needed a higher power. And finally, he entrusted his life and the care of his life into the hands of God. And that became step three. But that was a real step for Bill W. He gave his life to Christ, and it totally changed him. He stopped trying to control his own life. He recognized he needed God's help, and finally he surrendered his life to Christ. And when he did that, he began to study with a group of Christians called the Oxford Group, and they studied the wisdom of Christ. And it was while he was studying the wisdom of Christ that he developed the 12 steps. The 12 steps are incredibly biblical. They come right out of the teachings of Christ, every one of them. And today, I want us to look at step number 11, because whether you're an alcoholic or not, this is a step that is essential for all Christians. Step number 11 says that to seek through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God. to seek through prayer and meditation. We all read about prayer and meditation in the New Testament. We're familiar with that. To seek through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God. I need to improve my conscious contact with God. I don't know about you, but there's always more that I can be doing to spend more time with God, to be more aware of God, and to spend more time in His presence and to be receptive. So he says we do that through prayer and meditation. Now, traditionally, when you think about prayer, we think about us speaking to God in prayer. We prayed today, and I spoke to God, and I hope you spoke silently as I was, and you pray to God. But we think of God, of His prayer, as us talking to God. Whereas meditation is where we stop talking and we just sit in God's presence and enjoy His presence. And hopefully in that quiet meditation, we become receptive to what God wants to say to us. Because a relationship is not just us talking to God all the time. And if your entire prayer life is you talking to Him, which is oftentimes us giving Him a shopping list of what we want Him to do, that's not a relationship. The relationship is when we stop talking and we listen and be receptive. And that requires silence. So a very rare quality in our world today. It's hard to find a place of silence. But that's going to be necessary if we're going to improve our conscious contact with God, as he says. Psalm 46:10 is a verse everybody knows. It says, to be still and to know that I am God. I've heard of people who meditate with these two phrases, and when they breathe in, they say, be still. And when they breathe out, they say, and know that I am God. And they breathe in, be still. And they breathe out and know that I am God. And that helps them to focus on that relationship, the silence, being receptive. It's so hard for us to be still. Our minds are racing. Our thoughts are going 90 miles an hour. It takes a while for us to be still. We can't do it in a minute or two. We need to set aside a block of time. And you have to start that time by slowing down all of this racing mind that's going on. You need to shut off all the electronic devices and just sit there and be still. And be still. And as we silence ourselves and quiet ourselves in God's presence, we are reminded that He is God and I am not. That He is in control. I am not in control. He is the one that can change things. I cannot. And the more we meditate on that, the more life begins to make sense. And the more wisdom begins to come to us about how to deal with all of the problems that we have in our lives. And it comes through quieting ourselves. We know that David himself, who wrote this, David spent hours out in the fields as a shepherd and just in the presence of God and writing songs to God and listening to God speak to him. We know that Jesus used to sneak off up on the hillside and the mountainside where he could get away from the crowds and even away from his disciples and be alone with his Father and spend hours, sometimes before he had an important decision to make, before he selected the disciples, and before he would face some of the trials, he would stay all night on the mountainside just in the presence of his Father, speaking and listening to God speak to him. I don't think we do that anymore. I think it's a lost art, and there's something that's severely important that has been lost when we lose solitude and silence and meditation. Sometimes in silent prayer and meditation, we sit down. You have that picture of people who practice yoga where they cross their legs in a way that break my knees right off, and they say Om and they quiet like this. So we have that picture of meditation. But for some of you, and for me, the best time for me to meditate is when I walk. If I can go walk on the beach early in the morning before it's crowded and just be out there surrounded by God's glory, I can meditate much better there. If I try to do that at home, I fall asleep in 5 minutes. But I can walk and meditate and focus on God and listen to God and be more receptive when I'm walking than when I'm home sitting. So being still doesn't necessarily mean being motionless. I've talked to people who say that the best time for them, their best prayer times, are in the car. Now, it probably doesn't work good in rush hour traffic because you get so angry and caught up in it, but if you have a long car ride and it's kind of open roads and you can just turn off the radio and be alone and have that time with God, that can be a time of rich meditation and quiet and silence before the Lord. But it's up to us to turn off the noise when it happens. When I walk, it's up to me to turn off, to take the headphones out and turn off the phone and listen only to God. In the Old Testament, we see God sometimes calling his people into action to go fight the enemy. You picture David and Goliath as a perfect example. The enemy was coming out, and Goliath shouting and insulting the people of Israel day after day, and they all quaked in fear. And God called little David there to go out and fight the battle and to use his sling and to kill the enemy. And he was actively involved in fighting the war. Sometimes God called his people to go out and fight. But sometimes God called his people to stay back and do nothing. I'll give you an example of that. In Exodus chapter 14, if you remember, he had called Moses to come in and deliver Israel from slavery in Egypt. And Moses came in, and through the power of God, the plagues took place, and every time the Pharaoh would say, okay, I'll let you go, and then he'd change his mind. I'll let you go, and he'd change his mind. Finally, in the 10th plague, the firstborn of every Egyptian dies, including the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh tells Moses to get those people out of here as fast as they can. And Moses leads Israel out of Egypt, but they're not too far away when the Pharaoh changes his mind again. He says, what have I done? I've lost my whole workforce. And he gathers his entire army in the chariots and this massive army and takes off after Israel. And Israel is kind of trapped because the Red Sea is right there, and they don't know where they're going to go, and they see this army bearing down upon them, and they're terrified. The people rebel against Moses and say, why did you bring us out here to die? Weren't there enough graves back there that we could be buried there? You want to bring us out here? Is that why? They literally said that. And Moses goes to God. And I want you to hear what God said in response. It's in Exodus 14. We're starting in just 2 verses. In verse 13, Moses answered the people. He said, do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. In verse 14, he says, the Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. So you know what they did? They did nothing. They didn't pick up swords. They didn't shoot arrows. They didn't throw a single punch in the battle. But what God did was, through instructing Moses, he parted the sea. And he had all of his people walk through the sea on dry land and come out the other side. Well, of course, the Egyptian army raced in after him so they could capture him, and God just closes the sea, and the entire Egyptian army drowned, and this little band of Israelites defeated a mighty army of Egyptians without firing a single arrow or sword. He said, the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. I really believe that for some of you today, this is exactly what God wants to say to you. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. I know you think you're in control. It's an illusion. You're not. I know you think you have to do these things in order to win. You don't. There are many times when you need only to be still and know that he is God. He will fight the battle, and he will win the battle. David, when he wrote the 23rd Psalm, which I read just yesterday at Daryl's memorial, he calls us to lie down in green pastures. He leads us beside quiet waters so that he can restore our soul. And some of you right now, you need to have your soul restored because you've been too busy. You've been beaten down by the world, and you've been just overwhelmed with worry and fear and anxiety. and you need your soul to be restored. And what he would say as the good shepherd is he would say, come with me, and I want you to lie down in these green pastures and just be still. I want you to just drink from these quiet waters and just trust me as the shepherd that I will protect you. I'll take care of everything else. You don't have to worry about anything. You know those sheep, when they're lying down in the green pastures and they're eating, when they're beside the still waters, in their little sheep brains, they're not thinking about what's going to happen next week. What if we finish all this grass? There won't be any more grass left. Where are we going to get grass? They got little tiny pea brains. And guess what? The Bible compares us to the sheep. It's not a compliment. Sheep are the dumbest animals in the world, and they can't defend themselves. He says, you're like sheep. You've all gone astray, like sheep. And now you all need to just stay close to the shepherd. Lie down. Let him feed you. Let him refresh your soul with quiet water and restore your soul. John Cassian was a great spiritual leader back in the 5th century. And he knew that it was the nature of mankind that when you just sit down and try to meditate on God, that we get easily distracted. And he discovered that sometimes a little bit of motion actually helps you to quiet your mind. And so he instructed the monks that were under his leadership to weave baskets while they prayed. And they would weave baskets, and they would listen to God, and they would meditate to God while they were weaving baskets. St. Augustine told his people to walk. He said that he would take them out and he would walk with them, long, long walks as they would meditate on God. He had a phrase that was solvitur ambulando. It translated, it is solved by walking. People would come to him with all their worries and their anxiety, and he would say, it is solved by walking. You go walk and listen to God. And for many people, that's the way they meditate, the best way they can meditate. In the New Testament, you have the picture of Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus, listening to Jesus. She's quiet. She's a little too quiet for her sister Martha, who is killing herself in the kitchen, frantically preparing the meal. And she comes out, Martha does, and actually yells at Jesus, you tell my sister to come help me. And Jesus says, there's only one thing that's important, and Mary has chosen what's best. And what is best for you is not to be frantically serving God so that you're in a frantic tizzy over the whole thing, but what's best is to quietly sit at his feet and listen to him speak to your heart. Now, I have some bad news for you when it comes to your ability to meditate and to listen to God. The bad news is that your attention span is getting shorter and shorter. Not just you, but all human beings. They measure these things. I don't quite know how they do it. But in the year 2000, when they measured people's attention span, they found that they could focus on something, at the average that they could focus on something without getting distracted was 15 seconds. That's not really impressive, is it? 100 years ago, I hate to think how much longer it was before they had all kinds of electronic devices. But today, that's what it is. I've heard about the Sesame Street generation, because on Sesame Street, they change the picture like every 6 or 7 seconds. So children get bored if the picture's there too long, so they constantly are changing what you're looking at. And a whole generation has grown up with that idea that if they have to sit and watch a teacher for an hour, they can't do it. They can focus for about 15 seconds. Well, at least they could in 2000, but the time has gone down now. Now, the new tests that show that the average attention span of a human being is 8 seconds. That doesn't bode well for us, does it? I hate to think where it's going to be 10 years from now. But here's what makes it even more embarrassing, is that they've also discovered that the attention span of a goldfish is 9 seconds. Our attention span now is less than the attention span of a goldfish. How does that make you feel? In other words, I would have better response if I took this sermon and went down to the pet store and preached to a bunch of goldfish. They would stay with me longer, is what this is telling me. part of that study, they asked people, if you have nothing occupying your attention, what do you do? 77% of people between the ages of 18 and 24, 77% of people said they reach for their phone. If they have just a few seconds, they reach for their phone. 77%. Now, for people over the age of 65, it was only 10%. Partly because they couldn't find their phone, I think. So if you're older, you think, well, I'm not like those kids always reaching. But that's a part of the problem. In fact, there's a professor at MIT named Shirley Turkle. That's her name. She's a professor of social studies and science. And she interviewed hundreds of people about their daily fixations on social media and new technologies. She's worried that at least one of the cost of all of this new technologies is an addiction to social media. And along with that comes the loss of solitude. So what Shirley Turkle does is she sets herself up when she's doing field studies, she sets herself up like next to the checkout line at the local grocery store when people are lined up. And she watches what they do if there's 2 or 3 people in front of them and they know that they're going to be there for maybe a minute, 2 minutes, and she just watches and takes notes on what they do. And then she'll set herself up like at a red light where cars are backed up for a while, and she watches to see what people do in their cars when they have to sit there for a few seconds. And a number of places like that where society forces us to wait. And what she said is, give people even a second, and they're doing something on their phone. She said, every bit of the research says people's capacity to be alone is disappearing. Now, I want you to think about this because I believe it's really a serious situation. That solitude is a precondition to listening to God. You can't listen to God when you're in a crowd, when there's noise. You know, the Old Testament talks about that still, small voice of God. And quieting yourself, learning to be alone with yourself, and solitude is essential for you to listen to God. It's when people are alone that they can examine themselves, can have deep thoughts, and can examine their own lives and see what's missing and what's off course and what changes need to be made. But when you fill every second of solitude with the phone, you lose the ability to be alone. You lose the essential element of solitude from your life. And when that's taken away from us, we no longer contemplate. We no longer listen to God. Somebody said that we are miles from wisdom because the internet encourages the opposite of what creates wisdom, and that is stillness and time. When stillness is taken away from us, and solitude and time, wisdom disappears because these things are essential for us to grow in wisdom. There's a doctor who came up with this revolutionary practice that has changed the way many surgery rooms operate. And he calls it pause points. This doctor's name is Atul Gawande. And he wrote a book called The Checklist Manifesto. He says that doctors can use these checklists to save lives and to reduce mistakes during surgery. So what he does is he forces these doctors to have 3 pause points during the course of surgery. A pause point is 1 minute. That's all. Just 1 minute where they are forced to stop and they have a checklist. The first one is before they give anesthesia. They have to stop. One of the things on the checklist is to make sure that this is the right patient that you're supposed to be giving the anesthesia to, because you know things like that have happened. So they do very simple things in their checklist during that pause point. And before the incision, there's another pause point to make sure that they're operating on the right leg or the correct leg and these sort of things. And then before they leave the operating room, there's one more pause point where they count all the sponges and the needles, make sure that they're not inside the patient. You've heard those stories too. Well, you wouldn't think that 3 minutes would make a difference, would you? 3 minutes. But listen to what happened. There were 8 hospitals that started doing this, and the rate of major complications for surgical patients dropped 36%. and the death rate fell 47% by adding 3 pause points. Think about your day. Think about when in your day could you add a pause point? A minute where you quiet yourself. Maybe before you get out of bed in the morning, you just pause and ask God to guide you that day. You know, many of you use prayer before a meal as a pause point. You pray before your breakfast, your lunch, and your dinner. You have a pause point built right into it, and that's a good thing. Sometimes you have a major event taking place at work and major decisions to be made. It'd be great to put some pause points into your day, even if it's just a minute, and have that focus on God. I think that each one of us, and I'm guilty myself probably more than any of you, each of us desperately needs to turn off the noise, to quiet ourselves and calm ourselves in the very presence of God, and to listen to Him, what He wants to say to us. In fact, I'd like to close our service right now by having a few minutes of silence. This is usually where I pray and I talk, but this time I want us to just listen for a moment. So I'm going to ask you where you are just to quiet your heart, your mind, close your eyes, just have a few moments of silence. And after that silence, keep your eyes closed. I've asked Mo and Andrew to sing a song to us. You're not going to stand. You're not going to sing with them. I want you just to continue a few moments of reflection and meditation while they sing to us. But start with a few minutes of silence right now.
Where will you run, my soul? Where will you go when wells run dry? When the wind starts to blow, how you gonna keep this flame alive? In the fading light when night is breaking, I know you will always be waiting. You'll always be there. I'm running to the secret place where you are, where you are. I'll sing to you of all the ways you stole my heart, stole my heart. Better is a moment that I spend with you than a million other days away. I'm running, I'm running, I'm running to the secret place. Ooh, 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 ooh. on which I stand. And you will not let me go. I know that I am safe inside your hands. In the fading light when night is breaking, I know you will always be waiting. You'll always be there. I'm running to the secret place where you are, where you are. I sing to you of all the ways you stole my heart, stole my heart. Better is the moment that I spend with you than a million other days away. I'm running, I'm running, I'm running to the secret place.